I've been asked to speak about the subject of communism. Is it more important is it more religious than Christianity or not? Which of these two religions is the more religious? So I'm going to major heavily on communism between now and noon, breaking in about an hour's time. And I'm not going to say much about Christianity because I look at you folks and it seems to me you do know a little bit about Christianity, probably a great deal. But what you really need to know and came here to learn is more about communism, what communism believes. So what I'm going to try to cover is the communist view of God, of physical laws, of the universe, of man, woman, sex, work, money, property, class, the family, education, morality, law and order, the state, nationality, the arts, science, religion, truth, revolution, war, peace, freedom, and the future. And then hopefully I'll have a little time left to summarize it all, so we'll see very clearly the distinction between these two religions. But I would say that right now in history, I do believe that communists are more religious than Christians. That is to say, communists are more dedicated to whatever it is they believe than Christians seem to me to be dedicated to what Christians tell me they believe in, I being a Christian and not a communist. First off, a few quotes. Joe Stalin stated, quote, "Leninism is Marxism in the epoch of imperialism and of the proletarian revolution. Marx and Engels lived and worked in the pre-revolutionary epoch, when developed imperialism did not yet exist. Leninism is the further development of Marxism." Khrushchev said, "The changes in the world will proceed in the direction well described by Marx, Engels, and Lenin in their theoretical works." Then in Moscow, 1968, Communist Party Soviet Union said the following at its All-Union Congress, quote, "Marx and Engels laid the foundation of communism as a science, and Lenin developed the theory of scientific communism so that the theory of scientific communism is now called Marxism-Leninism." And finally, Mao Zedong said, quote, "The theory of Marx, Engels, Lenin is universally applicable." End of quote. So if we then read the writings of Marx, Engels, and Lenin in depth, we will know what all modern communist leaders are committed to realize in the future and believe has taken place in the past, as to where we are supposed to have come from and where they are quite convinced, in spite of hiccups like the Berlin Wall coming down, they still believe that the world is headed. Okay, what do communists believe about God? And they sure are believers. They are very religious people when it comes to God. They are very religiously opposed to any idea of God. Lenin said, "The materialist exalts the knowledge of matter, of nature, consigning God and the philosophical rabble that defends God," that's you and me, "to the rubbish heap." Engels said, "The human being's own nature is much more glorious and sublime than the imaginary nature of all possible gods, which are, after all, only the more or less unclear and distorted image of the human being himself." He also said, or rather Lenin did, quote, "Every religious idea, every idea of every god, even every flirtation with a god is an unspeakable abomination, is the most dangerous abomination, the most repulsive infection." The famous modern Soviet philosopher Afanasyev stated, quote, "In a world where matter is the primary cause, the primary foundation of everything, there is room neither for God nor for any supernatural force." Engels and Lenin both stated, Engels first and Lenin affirmatively quoting Engels later, quote, "From the moment that man is able to produce things, he knows things in themselves. The Christian God, if he existed and created the world, could do no more." Marx stated in his doctoral dissertation, Prometheus' admission, you remember in Greek mythology, that's the fellow that stole the fire from the gods. Prometheus' admission, "All gods I hate," is its own admission, its motto against all gods, heavenly and earthly, who do not acknowledge the consciousness of man as the supreme divinity. There must be no God on a level with it. End of quote of Karl Marx. Now you may say that's just Western propaganda. No, every one of those quotes that I have given you comes either from the original German of Marx and Engels, which I have waded through, all 40 volumes, published by the Communist Party of East Germany, or which I have read in English translation from Russian into English of Lenin, published with the imprimatur and the nihil obstat of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, published there in the English language by either Progress Publishers or the Foreign Languages Publishing House in Moscow. So I've done my homework, and I will stand up to any communist anywhere in the world that what I have just read you truly is what the Marxists themselves say in their own documents. Now, I think you'll agree that what I've just read you, the communist view about God, is pretty religious in its denial of God. And what disturbs me is we're running short of Christian fanatics who are as outspoken, asserting the existence and the necessity of the triune God with the same vehemence as the communists deny the existence of any God. Okay, what do communists believe religiously about physical laws? Marx says the correct laws of dialectics are already contained in Hegel in mystical form. This form must be stripped off. Engels adds, in nature, insofar as we disregard the reaction of man upon it, there exist only unconscious blind agents which influence one another and through whose reciprocal interplay general laws assert themselves. Nothing is eternal except eternally changing, eternally moving matter and the laws according to which it changes. Lenin adds, the laws of the external world of nature, which are divided into mechanical and chemical, are the bases of man's purposive activities. Law is the enduring and persisting in appearance. Law takes the quiescent. Therefore, law, every law, by that he means physical laws, is narrow, incomplete, approximate. Law is the reflection of the essential in the movement of the universe. This reflection is by no means a simple, immediate, total affair, but rather a process involving a series of abstractions, formulations, the framing of concepts and laws. All boundaries in nature are arbitrary, relative, movable, and express the gradual approximation of our reason toward the knowledge of matter. Now, what are they saying here? They're saying that the whole universe is governed by certain inflexible laws, but that each of those laws is constantly changing within itself, and second, that man is only able to approximately understand those laws, harness them, and shape the future. But this is believed very religiously, and I may say not very empirically. It's a matter of blind, atheistic religious faith on the part of the communists. Next, let me interrupt for 1 second. I much appreciate the kindness of the host pastor in allowing us to meet here in this way. I learned just a couple of days ago, sir, that one of your best friends is one of my best friends, Joe Morecraft. So I'd like to take your photograph too. And when you next talk to Joe, whom you resemble, physically, please honk twice and say to him that I still love Jesus. Will you do that? Okay, thank you. All right, back to communism. How do communists take a look at the universe? Engels says, the whole of nature has its existence in eternal coming into being and passing away, in ceaseless flux, in unresting motion and change. Lenin adds, the material, perceptible universe to which we ourselves belong is the only reality. The electron is as inexhaustible as the atom. Nature is infinite, but it exists infinitely. We may regard the material and cosmic world as the supreme being, interesting statement, as the cause of all causes, and as the creator of heaven and earth. So what he's saying is, in the beginning, everlasting matter, which always has existed, created the present universe. That's what he's saying. The modern Soviet philosopher Afanasiev stated, quote, it is only a religious fable that God created the world. If matter is primary and eternal, which of course the communists believe, then it is uncreatable and indestructible. Matter is the inner, final cause of everything. Engels stated, the associate and bosom friend of Karl Marx, it is established that wonders do not occur in nature, and that the original heat of the nebula was not imparted to it by a wonder external to the world. The innumerable suns and solar systems of our island universe, bounded by the outermost stellar rings of the Milky Way, developed by contraction and cooling from swirling, glowing masses of vapor. And Karl Marx adds, at the very time that geology, especially through its subscience geogony, the scientific understanding of how our Earth came into being, was developing in an evolutionary direction about 130 years ago, Marx stated, quote, the idea of the creation of the Earth has now received a severe blow from the idea of geogony. In other words, the geological theories of Lyell and people like that, in his opinion, had put paid to the Christian notion that in the beginning the triune God is supposed to have created the earth. Now, if you've been bored up to this point, I think I'll have your attention starting now, because we're going to deal with man, woman, and sex, and the family. So, hang on to your hats. According to Marx, this is what man is like. Once the essence of man and of nature, man as a natural being and nature as a human reality, has become evident, the search for an alien being, God, a being outside of man and nature, a search which is an avowal of the unreality of man and nature, becomes impossible. So when you've discovered that the only God that exists is man, then the false notion that there could be a God other than man melts away of its own accord. That's what he's saying. Engels adds, the first cell, some cell, almost a divine cell, this one, with a huge potential. Listen to this. The first cell provided the foundation for the morphological development of the whole organic word. In the beginning was the cell, and the cell was with the cell, and the cell was God, and everything that would grow out of the cell. The first to develop from the cell were innumerable species of non-cellular and cellular protista. That's interesting. From the cell proceeds the non-cell as well as other cells. Some of these protista became gradually differentiated into the first plants and others into the first animals. And from the first animals were developed, essentially by further differentiation, the numerous classes, orders, families, genera, and species of animals. And finally, mammals, the form in which the nervous system attains its full development. And among these, again, finally, that mammal in which nature attains consciousness of itself, namely man. Lenin adds, man was originally a herd of apes which grasped sticks. Engels adds, the generation of fire by friction gave man for the first time control over one of the forces of nature, and thereby separated man forever from the animal kingdom. Marx said that Benjamin Franklin was right in his statement that man is a tool-making animal, but by animal, misquoting Franklin, Marx meant by animal something very different to what Franklin meant. Franklin meant living being. Marx meant highly developed kind of pre-human animal that somehow became human. Engels says, man makes nature to serve his ends. This is the final essential distinction between man and the other animals. Well now, if that's where man is supposed to have come from, according to these religious communists, where do you think woman came from, according to these religious communists? Listen. Marx says, are you feminists listening? Are you anti-feminist listening? Okay. Marx said, social progress can be measured exactly by the social position of the fair sex, the ugly ones included. Engels added that two people are as such entirely equal in relation to each other is a great exaggeration. Here's one of the sensible things that Engels once said. Men are not equal to women, nor women to men. Two people, even as such, may be unequal in sex. This simple fact leads us to the fact that the simplest elements of society are not two people, but one man and one woman who found a family. I've often wondered whether he was reading Genesis 2, though twisting it a bit, when he wrote that statement, which is one of his better statements. Of course, he quickly goes on to add this. The first class antagonism coincides with the antagonism between man and woman in monogamous marriage. The first class oppression ever was that of the female sex by the male. And of course, feminists are still saying the same thing today. Lenin has the following jewel. The chief thing is to get women to take part in socially productive labor, to liberate them from domestic slavery, to free them from their stupefying and humiliating subjugation to the eternal drudgery of the kitchen and the nursery. The most important step is the abolition of the private ownership of land and factories, and of course of man's private ownership of the body of the one wife that is married to under Christian marriage. This opens up the way toward a complete emancipation of woman, her liberation from household bondage through transition from petty individual housekeeping to large-scale socialized domestic services. Doesn't that thrill you, ladies? The communists want to yank you out of your kitchen where you are cooking food and washing up the dishes for your husband and your kids, and they want to dump you into some huge factory where you'll be washing up thousands of dishes and cooking thousands of turkeys for people that you don't even know what their name is. I'm not saying that I'm thrilled to wash up dishes, but I'm saying I'd far rather wash up dishes for my family than for 1,000 people that I don't know. And Mao Zedong says, the demand that all women who are able to work, by that he means take on a second job outside of their home until they flop of nervous exhaustion, the demand that all women who are able to work must take up their position in the lines of the labor front, notice must, not may, according to the principle equal pay for equal work must be realized in the shortest possible time, unquote. And now, let's see what the many religious things that communists say about sex. Marx and Engels say the following. Originally, the division of labor was nothing else than the division of labor in the Sex Act. It's one of the most ridiculous statements that's ever been written, because you see, the monkeys from which the first men are supposed to have descended also practiced sexual intercourse. That must then mean that the monkeys, because they were capable of sexual intercourse, must have been able to labor and to divide labor, in which case there was a capitalistic division of labor even before those monkeys evolved into the first human beings sleeping around when the division of labor is supposed to have started. So there's a terrible inconsistency here in communist theory. But anyway, that's their problem, not mine. Next time a communist says to you there's a contradiction between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, you remind him of this inconsistency in the communist writings. Marx and Engels also say the communists have no need to introduce community of women. It has existed almost from time immemorial. Engels says, I was just in the middle, happy and contented, of writing about group marriage. Lenin says, you are doubtless acquainted with the capitalist theory that in communist society of the future, the satisfaction of the instincts of the craving for love is as simple and unimportant as drinking a glass of water. This glass of water theory has driven some of our young people quite crazy. It has been the destruction of many young men and women. Of course, thirst does cry out to be quenched. And Engels lets the cat out of the bag where he states, quote, the study of the history of primitive society reveals to us the conditions in which men lived in polygamy and their wives at the same time in polyandry. The next higher plane of society after capitalism will be a revival in a higher form of this ancient society. In other words, what he's saying is this. In the beginning, the first men had community of property and community of women and community of male spouses. Then capitalism, that great sin, came and destroyed this ideal society. And capitalism introduced monogamy. However, when communism destroys capitalism, after an interim phase of socialism, there will be a return at a higher level to communism, which must mean the destruction of the family and all men and women sleeping around with one another all over again and not knowing who the father is of the child that's born. And after the child has been taken away from the mother and put into the state creche, the day school, the daycare center, I think it's called in the United States, that child won't even recognize its own mother soon. And the loyalty will be exclusively to the group, to the herd. That's communism, past and future. Now let's take a look at the religious view of communism toward work. Marx says, by work, man becomes himself. Work is the becoming of self. Marx and Engels wrote, life involves before everything else eating and drinking, a habitation, clothing, and many other things. The first historical act is thus the production of the means to satisfy these needs, the production of material life itself. In communist society, meaning way out in the future, each will be accomplished in any branch of activity, and society will make it possible for me to do one thing today and another thing tomorrow, just as I have a mind. In other words, you become a nuclear scientist today, and the following day you become a great painter, and the day after that you become a cattle rancher. They really believe that under communism this is the way it will be. And then when you get tired of cattle ranching after a day, you go back to nuclear physics or some other thing that you didn't do before. Lenin says, communist labor is labor performed free of charge for the benefit of society without expecting any reward, as the requirements of every healthy organism. We shall work to do away with the accursed maxim, every man for himself and the devil take the hindmost. That's the motto, of course, of people cruising down the freeway in L.A., right? We will do away with the habit of looking upon work merely as a duty and of considering rightful only that work which gets paid for. We shall work to inculcate into people's minds, to turn into a habit, and to bring into the day-by-day life of the masses the rule all for one and one for all. Sounds like a rerun of an Errol Flynn movie from the mid-40s. The rule, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. We shall work for the gradual but steady introduction of communist discipline and communist labor. He wrote this, by the way, after Russia had fallen under his control. We shall keep on working for years and decades, practicing subotniks, that is, after you put in your 8 hours paid labor in the Soviet Union, you are then required to go and donate a further 5 hours labor per day for free doing something else. That's the subotniks. And he says, we will practice the subotniks, developing them, spreading them, and converting them into a habit. We shall achieve the victory of communist labor. End of quote. What do these people believe about money? Here again, they're very religious. If you think Americans worship money, wait till you hear this. Karl Marx said, whenever we regard goods as wares, we regard them exclusively from the sole perspective of concretized, visibilized, centralized social labor. Money is the jealous God of Israel, before whom there may be no other God. Money humiliates all human gods and changes them into a commodity. Money is the alienated being of man's labor and existence. This foreign being controls him and he worships it. Engels says, talking about the end of primitive communism, before slavery and later capitalism developed, it's gold and silver which civilized man and ruined the human race. And Lenin states, our aim is to ensure that every toiler, having finished his 8 hours task and productive labor on salary, shall perform state duties without pay, the subotniks, 5 hours a day for free, as I said earlier. The Russian Communist Party will strive as speedily as possible to introduce the most radical measures to pave the way for the abolition of money. First and foremost, to replace it by savings bank books, checks, short-term notes entitling the holders to receive goods from the public stores for free, and so forth. And this, of course, immediately leads to the communist view of property. Marx and Engels state, wife and children were the slaves of the husband. This hidden slavery in the family, though still very crude, is the first private property. You people are horrified at our intention to do away with private property. You reproach us with intending to do away with your property. Precisely so, that is just what we intend. Engels adds, the phrase abolition of private property is the most succinct and characteristic way of formulating the change in the social order which has been rendered necessary by the development of large-scale industry. The communists are right, therefore, to place abolition of private property in the very forefront of their demands. A nation, or even all simultaneously existing societies taken together, are not the owners of the globe. They are only its possessors, its usufructuaries. And, like boni patres familias, that is to say, like good stewards, they must hand it down to succeeding generations in an improved condition. And Lenin adds, landed proprietorship is abolished forthwith throughout the Soviet Union without any compensation. He said this right after the communist takeover of Russia, 1917. All damage to confiscated property, which henceforth belongs to the entire people, meaning the Communist Party, is hereby proclaimed a grave crime to be punished by the revolutionary courts. Workers' control over the production, storage, purchase, and sale of all materials shall be introduced in all industrial, commercial, banking, agricultural, and other enterprises. And he also says, and there'll be no getting away from it. What do communists believe about class? Marx says, all past history, with the exception of its very beginnings, is the history of class struggle. These antagonistic classes of society are always the results of the modes of production and exchange, in one word, of the economic conditions of their times. What I did, says Marx, that was new, was to prove the following. First, that the existence of classes is only bound up with particular historic phases in the development of production. Second, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat under the first phase of communism right after the revolutionary takeover from capitalism. Third, that this dictatorship of the proletariat itself only constitutes the transition towards the later abolition of all classes and to a classless society. In other words, he denies that at and right after the communist revolution, the takeover from capitalism, you immediately go to a classless society. That's not what happens. What does happen, he would say, is the previously oppressed class, the workers, through their agent, the Communist Party, suppresses all other classes, the capitalists, the small farmers, the petty shopkeepers, and everyone else. So the class war, make no mistake, continues after the collapse of capitalism in the first phase of socialism. In fact, it becomes even more of a war in the socialist country than it ever was in the capitalist country, according to Karl Marx, which is something you might want to remember next time you talk to a leftist. And Lenin adds, classes are groups of people, one of which may appropriate the labor of another because of the different places they occupy in the definite system of social economy. Whoever conceives of the transition to socialism without suppressing the middle class is just not a socialist. It is essential to suppress the middle class as a class. That means you. There can be no socialism unless you are suppressed. All right? A communistically organized society of the future will provide for the cultivation of all-round capacities. Simultaneously with this development, social classes will vanish, for class cannot exist in a communist society of the future, for indeed the whole organization of society will preclude the existence of different classes. Finally, the Communist Party itself will become dissolved, but only when the whole working class worldwide will have become communist. And that, everyone in the Soviet Union and in Red China who is a member of the Communist Party, they'll tell you that has never been achieved. They've never claimed it's been achieved. Can only be achieved in the distant future after the United States has been smashed and forced to relinquish capitalism to go down the road of socialism towards future communism. In other words, Red China and the Soviet Union, which have never ever become communist countries, and which say that it's impossible they can become communist countries unless the United States embraces socialism and declares itself on the road toward communism. Now, obviously, if you believe that in the Soviet Union, you're going to work night and day to smash the United States and to turn it into a socialist country. Because there's no way you in the Soviet Union as a communist can advance from Soviet socialism towards Soviet communism until you've got the United States to become socialist and to declare itself in favor itself of advancing towards communism. If you forget everything else I've said, please remember that. That's the key to understanding these hiccups that we're seeing in Eastern Europe today. A few holes in the Berlin Wall and so forth. Okay, now let's take a look at the communist view of the family. And here again, these people are very religious. They are fanatically, religiously dedicated to smash the family, as you will see. Karl Marx said this: the capitalist system, by assigning an important part in the process of production outside the domestic sphere to women, to young persons, and to children of both sexes, has created a new economic basis for a higher form of the family in the future and of the relations between the sexes under coming socialism. It is absurd to regard the Christian form of the family as absolute and final. He also says this: once the earthly family, that's a man, wife, and children, has been discovered to be the secret of the Holy Family, that means God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, then the earthly family must itself be destroyed in theory and in practice. This came up in the debate we had the other night between myself on the one hand and a speaker on the other hand who declared himself both Marxist and Christian, Baptist minister who has a PhD in religion at Harvard. Anyway, he said that Marx had never said this. And I said Marx did say this. And I quoted the quotation twice. And he said Marx didn't mean that literally. I said, yes, he did. Marx says the earthly family must be destroyed in theory and in practice. And then I said that what Marx actually said was, ebenso muss auch die irdische Familie praktisch und theoretisch vernichtet werden. But apparently, though I had the ability to speak in tongues and to know exactly what it was I was talking about when I did so, because I've done my homework reading these sources in the original German, as published recently by the Communist Party of East Germany, apparently not so my opponent, and he obviously lacked the charismatic gift of the interpretation of the tongue. Okay, that's Marx. The earthly family must be destroyed in practice as well as in theory. I don't know if that doesn't mean what it says it means. Language has no meaning as far as I'm concerned. It means exactly what it means. Engels says this: the study of the history of primitive society reveals to us conditions in which men used to live in polygamy and their wives at the same time in polyandry, and the common children, the communist children, the common children, therefore, are regarded as being common to them all, to the whole herd. In other words, when you give birth to a child, it's not your child, it's the child of the herd. And the herd is to feed it, the herd is to clothe it, and the herd is to educate it. You get the picture? That's communism. That's primitive communism, and that's what they want to achieve under future communism too. Okay. Engels also said, as men emerged from the animal world, there prevailed a certain equality in the conditions of existence, and for the heads of families a kind of equality of social production. That's rich. He wasn't really concentrating when he wrote that, because he speaks of heads of families within the family. Now, as you know, as good feminists, there's not supposed to be a head of the family, unless it be the woman, I suppose. But even Engels speaks of the heads of families, and then after that says there is no head. So, but anyway, I'm not responsible for the religious inconsistencies in the communist writings. They can sort these things out themselves. Lenin adds, a new form of family is developing. New conditions in the status of women and in the upbringing of the younger generation are now being prepared. The breakup of the patriarchal family. In other words, the family where the father is the head is breaking up, says Lenin. And finally, he says this: Soviet authority, which will become international, impels the Soviet republics toward amalgamation of all Soviet peoples into one socialist family. Now what he's saying is the time will come in the Soviet Union when the people of Estonia and Latvia and White Russia and the Ukraine and Kyrgyzia and Kazakhia and all the other non-Russian republics within the Soviet Union will realize there is only one family in the Soviet Union, and that's the Soviet Socialist family. That's step one. And then gradually other countries, such as Afghanistan first, and then finally the United States of America, are admitted into the Soviet Union as additional republics, like extra states to the Union, 48th, 49th, 50th state, and so forth, until finally the whole world is not only under one government, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, but it's one big happy family. Doesn't that thrill you? And they play Ring of Roses, not quite forever, as we'll see a little later. Okay, what about education? Well, this follows from the family. Marx says, from the factory system budded as the germ of the education of the future, an education that will, in the case of every child over a given age, combine productive labor with instruction and gymnastics, not only as one of the methods of adding to the efficiency of production, but as the only method of producing fully developed human beings. Engels adds, quote, the young folk of the future, as they pass through the schools, by which he means state schools, will be taught the whole system of production as part of their education. And Lenin adds, by educating the Workers' Party, Marxism educates the vanguard of the proletariat, which is capable of assuming power and of leading the whole people towards socialism, of directing and organizing the new order, of being the teacher, the guide, the leader of all the toilers. We must strive, listen to this, to secure the mixing of the children of all nationalities in uniform schools in each locality. So you see, busing was not developed in the United States. It was developed by Lenin in the Soviet Union. Marxists have a general school plan which demands, for example, an absolutely secular school. As far as Marxists are concerned, no departure from this general program is anywhere or at any time permissible. We are seriously carrying out the transference of the educational function from the separate household to society as a whole. The children are now being brought up in public education under more favorable conditions than at home. Doesn't that sound familiar? Now let's move on to the religiously communist view of morality. Marx says change is the very stuff of human nature. Substitute a communal and moral existence for the purely independent life with which we are all of us endowed by nature. We believe that all men are endowed with certain rights by an impersonal nature, which is not the creator, but which is the universe itself, which always has been around and always will be. That's what he's saying. Quite the opposite of the American constitutional documents. Engels states, we reject every attempt to impose upon us any moral dogma whatsoever as an external, ultimate, and forever immutable moral law, on the pretext that the moral world too has its permanent principles which transcend history and the differences between nations. In a future society, how does this grab you? In a future society in which the very motive for stealing will have been done away with, in which only lunatics would ever steal, how the teacher of morals would be laughed at, who tried solemnly to proclaim the eternal truth, thou shalt not steal. End of quote. Lenin adds, We don't believe in an eternal morality. We expose the deceit of all the fables about morality. Morality serves the purpose of helping human society to rise to a higher level and to get rid of the exploitation of labor. Is there such a thing as communist morality? Of course there is. We say that our morality is entirely subordinate to the interests of the class struggle of the proletariat. Under future communism, the necessity of observing the simple fundamental rules of human intercourse will very soon become a habit. In time, morals will be improved, perhaps by force of habit, so that even individual excesses will inevitably begin to wither away. Which brings us next to the religious view of the communists about law and order. Marx says society does not rest upon the law. Law must rest upon society. Engels adds, at a certain very primitive stage in the development of society, the need arose to coordinate under a common regulation the daily recurring acts of production, distribution, and exchange of products. To see to it that the individual does subordinate himself to the common conditions of production and exchange. This regulation, which is at first custom, soon becomes law. Justice is never anything but the ideologized, glorified expression of the existing economic relationships. And Lenin closes, sweeping away the law courts of the old order. They're going to get rid of the U.S. Supreme Court. That's good news, isn't it? Only problem is, they'll put a people's court there, which is 1,000,000 times worse. So count your blessings. Count your blessings with what you've got. Because you can get something a lot worse. Much, much worse than what you've got. Sweeping away the law courts of the old order, proletarian democracy issues the class watchword, election of judges from among the workers and by the workers alone. And if you think you've got no good judges at the moment who've been through left-wing law schools, wait till you find them put before the firing squad and some idiot people who can hardly read and write being appointed by the proletariat as the new judges. That'll be a lot worse. Says Lenin, and I think he's right on that. It will be. He also says the scientific concept dictatorship means nothing more or less than power which rests directly on violence, which is not limited by any laws or restricted by any absolute rules. That means after the revolution and the destruction of capitalism, under the first phase of socialism known as the dictatorship of the proletariat, there is no law. They do what they want and they do it violently. That's exactly what it means. Lenin also says the courts, that is the socialist courts, must not eliminate terror. For us to promise this would be self-deception or fraud. It must explain and legalize terror in principle, without falsity and without embellishment. And then looking ahead of socialism toward future communism, Lenin says, the perfect state of society in which all laws, discipline, and government will become unnecessary, where people will gradually become accustomed to observing the elementary rules of social intercourse without force and without compulsion. That's still ahead, way in the future. Which brings me to the communist view of the state. Now here, Marx says the following. The so-called Christian state needs the Christian religion to complete itself as a Christian state. The democratic state, that means the non-Christian state, the real state, does not need religion to be politically complete. To the contrary, the democratic state can ignore religion, because the democratic state is the realization in a worldly way of the human basis of religion. Engels adds, the state has not existed from all eternity past. The state will inevitably fall. The society that will organize production on the basis of a free and equal association of the producers will put the whole machinery of the state where it will then belong, into the museum of antiquity by the side of the spinning wheel and the bronze axe. The government of persons will be replaced. The state will not be abolished. It will wither away. And Lenin wrote right before the successful Red Revolution of 1917. As a matter of fact, he never completed his book, State and Revolution, from which I now quote, because he had to stop writing the book in the middle and take over Russia. But in that book he had written this, quote, the state is a machine for the oppression of one class by another, for holding the other subordinated classes obedient. The proletarian and peasant Soviet Republic, he wrote after the revolution again, has now proved to be the first stable socialist republic in the world. As a new type of state, it cannot die. No power on earth can halt the progress of the world communist revolution toward the world Soviet Republic. The state will continue to exist until victorious socialism develops into full communism. Democracy is a form of state, and democracy will wither away when the state withers away. Now, this will take place first nationally and then internationally. What do communists believe about nationality? According to Marx, under future communism, quote, even the natural differences within the human species, like racial differences, must be done away with historically. End of quote. Marx and Engels together wrote, the communists are reproached with desiring to abolish countries and nationality. But the working men have no country. National differences and antagonisms between people are daily more and more vanishing. The supremacy of the proletariat will cause them to vanish still faster. Lenin stated, international culture, now already being systematically created by the proletariat of all countries, does not absorb national culture, no matter from what national group. But international culture accepts only from each national culture exclusively those of its elements that are consistently democratic and socialistic. Come back to that in a moment. We are internationalists. We stand for the close union and complete amalgamation of the workers and the peasants of all nations into one single world Soviet Republic. We must therefore strive persistently for the unity of nations, and we must ruthlessly suppress everything that tends to divide nations. Socialism is promoting and greatly accelerating the drawing together and the fusion of the nations. And summarizing the position of Lenin, Stalin quite rightly wrote in his own book, Problems of Leninism, that in the Soviet Union, the Russian people will get rid of all non-socialistic practices. The Ukrainian people will do the same. The Estonian people will do the same, and so forth. And then, after the Russians and the Ukrainians and the Estonians have all become fully socialist, even in their language, even in the vocabulary that they use, so that neither in Russian nor in Ukrainian nor in Estonian will there be any remnants whatsoever of their capitalist past. The very words used in those languages to describe capitalist forms of production will have disappeared. Only then, says Lenin and Stalin, will the different nationalities, the Russians, the Ukrainians, and the Estonians, etc., coagulate and amalgamate together. Meantime, back at the ranch, while all of this is supposed to be going on in the Soviet Union, something similar is going on in North America and in South America. That is to say, the differences in South America between Ecuador, Peru, and Chile under future socialism begin to be removed. All words and concepts and languages and racial distinctions in those countries between one another are ditched, and they all accept and all coagulate toward a joint Spanish-speaking future socialist culture with no remnant of communism in it. And then, says Stalin, the time will come when the same process has been going on next door in Brazil through the medium of Portuguese, that Spanish and Portuguese will merge, and then German and English will merge, and finally Germlish or Engleman, that new culture, will merge with the Soviet culture, which will be an amalgamation of Russian, Ukrainian, and all the other things they've got there into one worldwide communist culture, language, and race. That's the theory. Well, perhaps this might be a good point to pause for me to lubricate my throat and for you to do the same, and to come back and deal with some of the much more exciting things that these religious communists plan for you and for me and our children and grandchildren in the future if we allow them to do so. So let's take a break for 5 or 10 minutes.